We're now going to be talking about education systems assessment, and for that you really need to be measuring at a large scale. So this session is going to talk about where do we get that large scale data from. We're going to start with a very simple question. It's like, how do we know whether a nation is proficient? How do we measure that progress towards SDG 4? How do we know whether sort of children leaving primary school are proficient in reading and maths? How do we quantify the learning crisis? How do we know if an intervention has had an impact? And for that, we need large-scale data. There's a load of different ways we can get that from. There are the large international assessments, PISA, PISA for Development, TIMSS, PEARLS. We'll talk through all of these in a bit more detail in this session, so don't worry about it just yet. There are regional assessments such as PASEC, which are a bit like PISA and things, but rather than being global, they focus in on a particular region. There are national educational assessments or national achievement surveys, such as NAS in India, which are specifically run to work out the health of that particular education system. There are citizen-led assessments such as ASER, which are, as they sound, citizen-led ways of trying to measure learning outcomes and qualities around the education system. It might be that there are individual program and research evaluations. So if you're running a one-year sort of intervention and you want some quick turnaround, you can't wait the 4 years for one of these bigger cycles. So you run your own research, or you might be doing something where you're actually looking at something very specific. So you get that data and you just run those surveys yourself. And then there are a load of other indicators and other sources. And we'll go through all of these and just give you a very brief introduction to where the data is, what their key factors are, etc. So the big international assessments, these are international scale assessments. I'm going to start with TIMSS and PEARLS. These are run by the IEA, which is an international sort of collaboration between educational assessment sort of organizations. It's run at grades 4 and 8 for the TIMSS, which is the Trends in Maths and Science survey, focusing on maths and science education. And then at grade 4 there is PEARLS, which is progress in reading and literacy. It's run on a 4-year cycle. It's curriculum based, so the collaboration, the consortium have got together, looked at all the various sort of education systems and said, right, we will assess on this average curriculum. There is PISA, which is probably the most famous one. It's run by the OECD. It's measuring 15-year-olds, so it's not grade-based, it's age-based. And it focuses on maths, science, reading. It's done on a 3-year cycle. And the focus shifts. So 1 year it'll be maths, 1 year it'll be science, 1 year it might be, well, not one cycle it might be maths, one cycle it might be science, one cycle it might be reading. And that's done because they're trying to balance the manageability. So if you try to have a focus on every single subject, it would make it a very expensive, very unwieldy, very sort of monolithic, monstrous assessment system. But by focusing on one in turn, so it's not the fact you don't do the other ones, but it will be that there will be more items and more better quality data around maths if that is the focus for that year. Because actually, realistically, you don't need to get really good data every 3 years on maths performance, because it's not going to change that fast. And if it is changing that fast, then the sort of normal cycle of reviewing will pick it up. So it's trying to balance manageability and cost versus data quality and trying to do it in a clever way. It's curriculum free, so it just says these are the skills we're looking for and this is how we'll assess them. And linked to that, there is PISA development. It's run by the PISA organisation. It's a rapidly and continually evolving state, but it's designed to cater for a larger and more diverse groups of participants. The original OECD was really designed to measure learner performance in industrialized and sort of developed countries. Whereas PISA development is trying to sort of assess a wider and more diverse group of participants. It's more focused about measuring progress towards the sustainable development goals. And again, the contextual questionnaires. So these are the questionnaires that are administered along with the assessments. So you've got some data about the students. So you know kind of what income household they are from, their parents' educational level, literacy levels, that sort of thing, how much access to resources they have. But those questionnaires are aimed more at LMI countries. So they will reflect slightly different outcomes that give more meaningful data. It tries to include out-of-school youth, but this is a really tricky thing to do. Trying to actually measure, or even identify out-of-school youth and then try and measure their learning outcomes is incredibly difficult and will depend on context. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops and how successful that is. And it was, as I said, it is a still evolving and developing part of it, and it's going to become part of PISA, I think. But it only really started serious trials in 2021. So it is still a young addition to this, these big international surveys. The next one, that sort of level down really, is the regional and national assessments. So as I said earlier, you've got the regional assessments such as PASEC and SACMEC in Africa. So PASEC is a West African-based around a group of Francophone countries that share similarities in their education system. But it's based in Francophone countries, but it is tested in the language of instruction. So it's meant to be able to measure learning ability in language of instruction, whether that's French or other regional languages. It's aimed at the beginning and end of the primary cycle, so grades 2 and 6. And that's so you can actually get good data about how effective that primary schooling is and how much value it adds into it. And it's focused, as a lot of these assessments, about language acquisition and mathematics. It's like a lot of these regional assessments have quite slow reporting times. So, for example, the data from the 2019 assessments was only reported in 2021 because there's a lot of data checking, a lot of reporting, and a lot of quality controls that go on around them. So they can be quite cumbersome things, but they give very good data. SACMEC is another one that's more South and Eastern African consortium of education, but that seems to have disappeared, which is a shame because it was giving some very good data. There are others. There's the Latin American Laboratory of Assessment and the Quality of Education, and the Pacific Island Learning and Numeracy Assessment. So it's where countries in a region have got together to try and pool resources and give comparable data with their sort of colleagues in neighbouring countries so that they can actually sort of improve collaboratively. Then you have the national assessment systems, and I'm differentiating these from the examination systems because they serve a different purpose. These are really research assessments, and they are to give the government good, independent, high-quality data about the learning and the education system. So they are achievement surveys, usually, but not always, they are in maths, language and science. They are sample-based, so it's not every student, but it's a sample designed to give a good representation of the learning outcomes across the country as a whole. Variable duration, some are run on fixed cycles, some they run as they have resources. They're usually aimed at key points in the education system and at the cycle of the education system designed by local policy. So they're really designed to give good data to governments about the policies decisions that they need. And then finally you have school examinations. These are sometimes used, but they are very variable quality. If you look at most examination data, they have large shifts in baseline and pass rates that are not due to changes in learning outcomes, but due to difficulties in the tests. And they can be of very variable quality. They can be focusing on different aspects than a lot of the SDG goals, because the main purpose is not reporting on those goals, but it's about using the examinations for other things, getting jobs, getting entrance to the next stage of education, getting into university, whatever. But they're not really designed to be measuring learning outcomes. They are there more as a selective measure or serving other purposes. And, we talked in the last session about the tensions. And if you use school examinations data, where the school examinations should have a very specific purpose that's not about reporting, it can lead to those odd things like we mentioned, ghost schools or tensions in the system that can cause problems. And then you have things that are outside sort of government control, such as citizen-led initiatives. So probably the most famous example and successful example of this is the annual Status of Education report, ASER in India, and that's starting to spread to other countries, and it was designed by the Pratham Network. It focuses not just on the outcomes, but also the processes in education and how schools are run. So you've got a good understanding of actually what the education system looks like on the ground, and how the wider social factors impact upon that and help or hinder. It's household-based rather than a school-based survey. So rather than going into schools, they actually go out into the villages and talk to households so they get a better, wider view of what is going on than if you just look at what's happening in schools. And it's based on a district-based random sample where they will, at a district level, they will randomly select villages, and within those villages select households. And then a researcher will go out and collect data from those households. And the data is collected on all children living in those sampled households, and by children we mean sort of age group 3 to 16. And they will also collect a load of household survey data. So data about the household that they can then use anonymously, but linked to those learning outcomes. So they can actually get some really nice results out of that. They also run a basic reading and a basic arithmetic assessment for any children in the house between the ages of 5 and 16. And they might, depending on the cycle, depending on current focuses, do additional tests. So they might be testing English ability, because that's quite important in India, but that will vary. So you have those citizen-led initiatives, which are usually more of a charitable nature. Beyond that, you have a lot of other initiatives that don't necessarily involve assessments, but make use of assessment data. And the ones you're likely to come across are the Human Capital Index. This is World Bank led. It really aims to capture data on health and education indicators and link that to what they call the productivity of workers, especially the next generation. So it's how effective is that education system in improving outputs and life chances, pretty much. There are various modules within there. I'm not going to spend too much detail on this Human Capital Index, but probably one of most interest is there is a module called Measuring Early Learning Quality and Outcomes, which is designed to help countries work out how effective their education system is, especially at the early years. And it links to data from, whether it's from PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, regional assessments, or EGRA and EGMA results. I'll talk about those a bit more later. So it links all the data it's getting about this wider sort of factors and links that into learning outcomes. Then you have things such as the Systems Approach for Better Education Results. Again, it's World Bank, so SABER. And it's more about comparative data and knowledge on education policies and institutions. It doesn't really cover assessments, but it does look at a lot of the infrastructure and human capital and other resources you need to conduct good assessments. So it's probably worth knowing about, and it's quite an interesting place to get data from about assessment competencies. And then you've got a load of research programs. So there's a raft of research tools and programs that use either specific assessment toolkits or off-the-shelf assessment toolkits to measure the impact of interventions or baseline the current status. I mentioned earlier you've got EGRA and EGMAR, which are two very common and popular toolkits. So EGRA is the early grade reading assessment, and EGMAR is the early grade mathematics assessment. So these are based around a model of a cognitive model of learning in language and mathematics that then tries to map that onto an assessment so you can plot how well students are learning in those two subjects. It's very good for baselining. It gives good, robust, quick results, but you do need a researcher to go out and administer these tests. It does get some criticisms that the results may not be comparable, and this is the same with the ASER tools, is that they give good, robust results, but they are not high grain quality. So they won't give you year-on-year comparability necessarily. But if you're just interested in whether a learner is functionally literate or numerate for that age, they will give you good results, and quite simply. There are some other issues in it, is that they assume that all maths and language learning follows the same cognitive path. And there are some concerns about that model. So just for example, if you're having to learn the Chinese alphabet compared to a Latin alphabet, you can see that there will be different challenges between those two. And similarly, if you're dealing with a language that is phonetically got a phonetic alphabet to one like English that has a non-phonic alphabet, again, it will be different. But you're not trying to compare apples and oranges here. It's about whether the question that you're interested in there is really just a very simple, broad question about, as I said earlier, are learners functionally literate, numerate at that stage? So you've got to make sure your toolkits will give you the answers to the questions you want and what you want to do with the data. Okay, that finishes my set of talks on assessment, and my colleague will talk about actually how do we know whether assessments are good, and then what do we use that data and how do we make that data inform policy.